All right, welcome back to the Security Plus preparation course. Today we're going to talk about malicious activity. So the agenda for today is we're going to be talking about DDoS, we're going to talk about DNS attacks, reversal attacks, we're going to talk about escalation and execution attacks, talking about those glorified replay and session hijacking attacks, on-path attacks, and some indicators of compromise. And remember, we're going to be thinking about these all in the terms of Security Plus. So some things we could go deeper and we're not going to go too deep with just because I don't want us to get too confused because the Security Plus really only wants us to know more definition. So let's start into it. Let's talk about DDoS. So DDoS is probably the most popular attack most people have heard of before. It stands for the Distributed Denial of Service Attack. It's basically when multiple compromised systems flood a single target, such as a website or a server or network, and this just helps overwhelm it with so much traffic that it prevents authorized users from accessing the resources or even crashes the resource. Now, how does it work? Well, it starts with botnet creation. So the botnet creation is normally when the attacker is going to infect a ton of devices with malware, turning them into bots or otherwise known as zombies, depending on how you read this. And these devices then collectively will be referred to as a botnet. The attacker itself will then select a target, such as a website or a server, and then often they will choose it for high visibility importance, such as online services. Think about Google. If you try to dig down Google or government websites, then they'll start flooding the attack. So they're flooding the target with commands where they'll send massive amount of volume to the target simultaneously. This could be HTTP requests, pings, or even just junk data. Then the server itself or services itself will then run out of resource or resource exhaustion, where the CPU memory is overwhelmed by the sudden large surge of traffic, and then legitimate users just won't be able to access it because resource depletion, effectively causing a denial of service. There are a few different ways of doing a DDoS attack. One of them is going to be the volumetric. These attacks aim to overwhelm the target's switch by flooding it with massive amounts of volume, like ICMP or often legitimate traffic. Or we can things like protocol attacks. Protocol attacks take network protocols to overwhelm the target's resources. The most popular here would be like the ping of death, using like ping 3 or hping 3, or we can use like SYN floods, which we can craft SYN floods even using the common tools like Nmap. Now, these two types of protocols are just not being used the way they were designed. So a protocol attack is normally taken as protocol and not completing how it's designed. Lastly, we have application layer attack, where we use legitimate requests like HTTP requests for web traffic, but we may focus on a single point of the application, like a single file on the server, to try to get it to be bogged down as much as possible. Well, how do we mitigate this? Well, we mitigate it through DDoS protection services. So a lot of times it's either third-party services or maybe even things like Cloudflare or Alchemy, where these services are designed to absorb large amounts of traffic or even filter out those malicious requests while still allowing legitimate requests through. We may even want a rate limit, basically restricting the number of requests that a user and IP address can meet. Now, this sometimes will work, but sometimes won't work from overloading the system. We might even want to do traffic filtering. Well, we'll use IDS or IPSs to make sure that it filters out malicious traffic before it even reaches the target. Might use something like anycast routing, which allows us to distribute the traffic across multiple servers in different geographic locations, making DDoS attacks that much harder to be successful. Or lastly, which as part of anycast routing would be redundant infrastructure, where we can have load balancers or multiple data centers all working in unison. So that way, if one server does become overwhelmed, legitimate traffic can be rerouted to others. Let's move on to DNS attacks. Remember, DNS is a fundamental component of the internet, and we use it every day. It takes human readable domain names and converts it from IP addresses and vice versa. Well, how does it work? Well, first, the DNS resolver is going to get the query from the user's browser and start looking up the first process. Normally, we'll call our DNS server, and then it may communicate with a root server. The root server itself will resolve from our DNS server and get the information from the top level domains such as .com or .org. And then the TLD server, the top level domain server is what that stands for, will then provide the resolver with the IP address of the authoritative DNS server. The authoritative DNS server will then provide an IP address back from the requested domain, and the response will then be returned to the browser, allowing it to connect to the website. Well, what are popular DNS attacks? Well, the first attack will be our DNS cache poisoning attack. DNS cache poisoning, otherwise known as DNS spoofing, occurs when an attacker injects false DNS records into the cache of a DNS server. As a result, the users are directed to an illegitimate website compared to the legitimate one, and this could be like phishing attacks, malware attacks, credential harvesting, whatever it may be. There could be DNS tunneling, where the DNS tunneling is a method where attackers use DNS queries and response to tunnels of other types of data, such as malware commands, like think of C2 servers. And since DNS traffic is allowed through firewall, DNS tunneling can be used to bypass security controls. So basically, we're pushing port 53 to do other things, such as data exfiltration or even importing data directly. We can use DNS amplification attacks, where it's a type of denial of service attack, but just for small DNS queries. So maybe we'll like spoof the IP address of a victim to an open DNS resolver, and the DNS resolver will respond with a large amount of DNS replies, overwhelming the victim's server, flood traffic. This amplification occurs when attacker sends a small request, but a bigger response comes through. We've got domain hijacking, where attacker will gain unauthorized access to the management console of the domain registrar. For instance, updating different things like DNS records, maybe redirecting traffic, or even transferring the domain to a different registrar, taking full control over the domain. We've got DNS reflection attacks, where the attacker will use a network of compromised devices to send DNS requests to an open resolver, spoofing the IP, being the victim being one of them, such like a botnet, which then the DNS server is going to all respond to the victim server, overwhelming it with traffic. Another way of doing a DDoS. We got typo squatting, where it's a social engineering attack where attacker registers a domain similar to a legitimate one, but making a very small change in the domain, hoping that either a user will accidentally mistype the legitimate domain or use phishing attacks to get you to click on the link to go to the illegitimate website. We got DNS flooding, where attacker overwhelms the DNS server with a high volume of requests. This way, again, we're exhausting the servers. Now, this is normally not a DDoS, but just a DOS attack when we're dealing with this. And then lastly, we have the fast flux DNS, where attackers are using to hide phishing and malware distribution sites behind rapidly changing IP addresses. This way, the attacker keeps changing and updating the DNS record associated with the malicious domain, making it very difficult to track it down. Let's go to a website attack, like a directory traversal attack. A directory traversal attack, known as a path traversal attack, occurs when an attacker manipulates a file path within the web application to try to get access to files that are outside the intended directory. What does that kind of look like? Well, here's an example straight from our book again. Here's an example of PHP, where the PHP says, hey, get that file name, and it's going to be in var www html user. But what happens if instead we do the file, we try to go up 4 levels, like ... and then we go to etc password? Will it let us? By doing that within the string, basically we're trying to get an etc password directory file being printed to the screen. If it let it, then we would get the password file from the server, allowing us to traverse throughout the path outside of the web server and access maybe any file within this server. And this is a very common misconfiguration within the web server itself. Let's talk about escalation attacks. An execution and escalation attack is a type of an attack where an attacker first gains the ability to execute malicious code on the target system, then attempts to escalate their privileges to gain more control over the system. Well, how does it work? Well, first we've got to get initial exploitation. Initial exploitation is where we're gaining a foothold into the system. Now, somehow they get in through a software and application. Maybe it's phishing, exploited, unpatched software, or even using social engineering attacks. Once they get in, they're going to execute their code. This gets them the ability to execute additional code onto the system. And at this point, they're going to try to find a way to get privilege escalation by exploiting, again, privileges within the operating system. And remember, we still have our vertical and horizontal privilege escalation here. And then lastly, we have post exploitation, where we are going to exploit our privileges to gain full control of the system. This way we can access or modify sensitive data, install rootkits, disable security mechanisms, or even move laterally to other systems, especially if we get domain admin credentials. Anywhere within that domain would we have full administrator credentials. Let's talk about replay attacks. Replay attacks themselves are a type of network attack where the attacker intercepts and captures valid data transmission, usually a session or authentication credentials, and then it will retransmit it at a later time to gain unauthorized access. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's say you're talking from your computer to a server, but meanwhile, the attacker is able to sniff that communication. They can see that communication, and what they'll do is they'll just replay it to the server, and hoping that that server's replaying of that transmission gives them access to the server. If it does, then they will have the same access that you would. There are a couple different commonalities when it comes to replay attacks. Most of it's going to be authentication replays or even session replays. We can do man-in-the-middle attacks where they position themselves directly between the two parties and act maybe as the server. So you think you're talking to the server, but really you're talking to them, and they'll replay the information to the server. Or it could just be a cryptographic replay itself, where even if the data is encrypted, the replay would be possible because maybe it doesn't validate uniqueness or timeness of the cryptographic, and so maybe the server will let them run the same cryptographic algorithms. Well, how do we protect this? Well, using a one-time use number, for instance, randomly generated values by the server to the host to have a transaction for each request. This way, if you do a replay attack, the attacker cannot use a previously captured request with the same unique number. Maybe we'll use timestamps or expirations, session tokens, and short lifespans. Maybe we'll do mutual authentication, basically saying we're going to re-authenticate every time we communicate, or maybe encryption with freshness validation, which allows us to, even if the data is encrypted, we can say the freshness of each request. So if the message has been used before, then the encryption will then no longer allow this to be used again and then deem the packet fake. Which brings us to session hijacking, where we take this a step further. It's a type of an attack where the attacker takes control of the legitimate user session of a web server, allowing them to impersonate the information. Now, this looks a lot like our previous example for replay attacks, but instead, what we're doing is we may be stealing the session ID. Now, these session IDs, or otherwise known as a token, will allow certain traffic while it's still valid, and allow us to then push on that session ID to gain access to the same server. So the user logs into the application, the session then gives them a token back, but the attacker steals a token mid-transit. The attacker also replays the same token while you still have access and gain unauthorized access to the server. Now, we've seen types of session hijacking before. One of them could be like cookie theft, basically looking at the session hijacking directly from your user session. We can use session fixation, which fixation attack allows the attacker to trick the victim into using a session ID that the attacker already knows, basically putting it like on the URL. It could be a man-in-the-middle attack where they're intercepting your traffic, so now they can use the same token in transit. It could be a cross-site scripting attack, an XSS attack, which could be where the hijack session is injecting malicious code into the website. It could be session prediction by using a previously known session. Maybe they can just increment the number and get a different session ID. Or it can even be session sniffing, where they're just looking on the network to see if they can find any session IDs and then just replaying those back to the server. Well, how do we fix this? How do we mitigate this? Well, using HTTPS helps. because at least if this data is encrypted, maybe they can't read it. Using encrypted cookies again, session expiration and timeouts, regeneration of session IDs, multi-factor authentication helps, monitor for anomalous behavior, which is very important. Or lastly, we've got session token binding, which session token binding is probably the most important one here, because maybe they can bind it to such as an IP address or something like that to make sure that the token and the IP address is then bind together, so that way if the attacker is trying to use a different public IP address, the server will deem it as a fake fake token. Let's talk about on-path attacks, otherwise known as man-in-the-middle attacks, occur when the attacker is secretly intercepting, potentially altering information between two parties. So the way that looks like is this. It's interception of the communication data itself, and it's just impersonating one or even both of the parties. Sometimes the man-in-the-middle attack is impersonating the user and then just relaying the information from the web server, and sometimes it does data exfiltration or manipulation, because guess what? Because it can read the data between the two endpoints, because once you have the data endpoints connected like that, then you're not encrypted anymore. They can read everything in plain text. Now, what are some vectors of on-path? Vectors of on-path would be like Wi-Fi eavesdropping, setting up rogue Wi-Fi access points, often called evil twin attacks, which mimic legitimate traffic, maybe HTTPS spoofing, fake websites, maybe DNS spoofing, pushing you to their fake website, while they may relay information to a real website. ARP spoofing, if they're within the same network, they can change the MAC addresses. They can do email hijacking, like email accounts, or hijack between the two, such as business and client, allowing attackers to manipulate the exchanges. So instead of sending the email to the person you thought they would then intercept it. Or lastly, we still have session hijacking here, where the attacker steals the token or even the cookie so they can just impersonate you directly. We talked a little bit about injection attacks before, but just bring these up again. Injection attacks occur when attacker sends malicious code or commands into a program by exploiting vulnerabilities in input fields or data processing mechanisms. And we talked about SQL and XML, but just know that there's a whole bunch of them that are out here. You can have SQL, you can have code command injection. Well, maybe you can inject a command within a URL parameter. You do LDAP injection, XML, XPath injection, such as XML databases, basically. You can do NoSQL injection, code injection again, or even header injection, where HTTP headers from the client and server, and this is normally used in cross-site scripting. So cross-site scripting to help redirect users to malicious websites, for instance. Again, you're going to notice the same vulnerability and mitigation techniques here. We've got input validation, parameters queries, escape special characters. We don't want those people putting code within our forms. We want to limit the privileged users, again, least privilege, content security policies, and then of course we do want to test all the software to make sure it's not prone to any of these incidents. All right, let's talk about the final one here, and this is indicators of compromise. And I'm going to go very high level on this one because you don't really need to know too much about the indicators of compromise, because that's really highly tested on the CISA Plus, CYSA. But for the SecurityPlus, we really aren't going to go that in depth. So just know that an indicator of compromises is any kind of data within the system that will allow us to know when it's being breached or currently under attack. And it doesn't matter what kind of system this is. This could be a host, this could be a network, this could be any type of system. Just know this helps us identify different types of attacks. Now, are there more information in the book? Absolutely. But that's really what you need to know for indicators of compromise for the SecurityPlus. All right. So here's our different types: file, network, behavioral, log, email-based, endpoints, DNS, anomalous privilege escalation. These are just different things that we would monitor. All right. Well, went through that section pretty fast, but that is section 19 for malicious activity for the SecurityPlus CYSO 701 exam. We'll be back with section 20 all the way through to section 26. Just know, hey, we're getting closer and closer to that final stage of being ready to take the SecurityPlus. And before we get going, we'll start taking more review sections as we go. So make sure that you're continuing with those flashcards, continuing understanding the terminology and where we would use these technologies, so that way if you're given a scenario within the Security Plus, you'll know exactly where to use it, how to use it, and answer correctly the first time and become Security Plus certified. See you for the next class.